The Delmore family fireplace burned for 17 years without stopping. Not once did the flames die down, not even during the scorching summers when temperatures reached 95 degrees. Neighbors would walk past their Victorian mansion on Elm Street, sweat dripping from their brows, only to see that familiar orange glow flickering behind the heavy curtains. Winter, spring, summer, fall, the fire never ceased. What made this even more peculiar was that no one ever saw them. Buying firewood, the local hardware store confirmed it. The coal delivery service had no record of the Delmores as customers. Yet somehow, that fireplace consumed fuel every single day for nearly 2 decades. The chimney released smoke so consistently that birds refused to nest anywhere near it. And the constant heat warped the wooden shutters on the 2nd floor. Margaret Delmore would smile politely when neighbors inquired about their heating bills, deflecting with comments about family recipes and old traditions. Her husband, Edmund, rarely spoke to anyone outside their immediate circle. Their 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and young Peter, were homeschooled, rarely seen playing in the yard like other children their age. But it wasn't just the perpetual fire that made the Delmores the subject of whispered conversations at the local diner. It was the way they seemed to exist in their own isolated bubble, completely detached from the rhythms of normal family life. The way their grocery deliveries arrived at odd hours, always when most people were sleeping. The way their mail was collected by hand, never left in the box for longer than 30 minutes. The most unsettling detail, however, was discovered by old Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the house directly across the street. She noticed that the Delmore's fireplace wasn't just burning continuously, it was burning the same fire. The pattern of flames, the way they danced and flickered, remained identical day after day. She began keeping a journal, sketching the flame patterns she observed through her kitchen window. For months, the drawings were remarkably consistent, as if someone was carefully maintaining the exact same configuration of burning material. When Mrs. Henderson finally worked up the courage to mention this to her daughter during a Sunday visit, her daughter dismissed it as the overactive imagination of a lonely widow. But Mrs. Henderson knew what she was seeing. She had studied those flames for over a year, and they never changed. Not the height, not the color, not the way they swayed. It was as if time had stopped inside the Delmore fireplace, preserving something that was never meant to be preserved. The fire that burned in the Delmore house wasn't warming a home. It was feeding something far more sinister, something that required constant attention and care, something that would explain why the family never left town, why they never took vacations, and why one of them was always awake at all hours of the night, tending to flames that had been burning since the day they moved to Elm Street. Welcome back to the creepy journal, where truth is often stranger than fiction, and the stories that disturb us most are the ones that actually happened. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a page from our dark journal of forgotten mysteries. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and gossip traveled faster than the morning newspaper. Nestled in the heart of Connecticut, this picturesque community of 4,000 residents prided itself on colonial charm and family values. Tree-lined streets wound past carefully maintained Victorian homes, each one telling a story of generations who had built their lives around tradition and respectability. The Delmore family arrived in Millbrook during the autumn of 1987, purchasing the largest house on Elm Street for a price that raised eyebrows throughout the neighborhood. The 3-story Victorian mansion had been empty for over 2 years, its previous owners having moved to Florida after retirement. Real estate agent Dorothy Mills later confided to friends that the Delmores paid in cash, no mortgage applications, no lengthy approval processes, just a briefcase full of money and a handshake that sealed the deal within a week. Edmund Delmore appeared to be a man of considerable means, though no one could quite determine the source of his wealth. He dressed in expensive suits, drove a pristine black sedan, and spoke with the refined accent of someone who had received an excellent education. His wife Margaret was equally polished, always impeccably dressed, her dark hair styled in a way that suggested regular visits to an expensive salon. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to luxury, yet there was something guarded about her demeanor that made casual conversation feel forced and uncomfortable. Their children seemed well-behaved and intelligent, but oddly mature for their ages. Thomas, the eldest of 15, rarely engaged in typical teenage activities. Elizabeth, 13, was often seen reading thick volumes that seemed far too advanced for someone her age. Young Peter, only 8 when they arrived, displayed an unusual fascination with fire that concerned several neighbors who witnessed him staring intently at lit matches and candles during rare public appearances. The Delmores integrated into Millbrook society with calculated precision. They attended church every Sunday, always sitting in the same pew, always arriving exactly 15 minutes before service began. Edmund made generous donations to local charities, ensuring the family name appeared on donor recognition boards throughout the community. Margaret volunteered for various town committees, though she rarely spoke during meetings and always seemed eager to leave as soon as business concluded. Despite their apparent efforts to fit in, there was an undeniable sense that the Delmores were performing rather than participating. Their interactions felt rehearsed, their smiles measured, their responses to questions carefully crafted to reveal nothing meaningful about their past or their daily lives. When neighbors attempted to learn more about their previous residents, the family would politely redirect conversations toward safer topics like weather or local events. The Victorian mansion they had purchased was a masterpiece of architecture, complete with ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a grand central staircase that commanded attention from anyone who entered the front hall. But the Delmores made modifications that puzzled contractors and neighbors alike. They installed heavy curtains on every window, blocking natural light from entering most rooms. They reinforced the basement door with additional locks and hardware. That seemed excessive for a residential property. Most notably, they renovated the main fireplace, expanding it significantly and installing what appeared to be a ventilation system that was far more complex than anything typically required for a standard home heating setup. The constant fire began immediately after these renovations were completed. From the very first night the Delmores spent in their new home, smoke began rising from the chimney, and it never stopped. Neighbors initially assumed they were simply adjusting to their new environment, perhaps overcompensating for the autumn chill. But as weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, the perpetual fire became a defining characteristic of the Delmore household. Local children would dare each other to walk past the Delmore house after dark, when the firelight created eerie shadows that danced across the drawn curtains. Parents would hurry their families past during evening walks, unconsciously quickening their pace as they passed the property. The house began to feel separate from the rest of the neighborhood, as if it existed in a different realm where normal rules didn't apply. But no one could explain why the curtains never opened during daylight hours, why the family never seemed to leave all at once, or why visitors were never seen entering through the front door. The Delmores had become a fixture in Millbrook, but they remained as mysterious as the day they arrived. The first person to notice something genuinely disturbing about the Delmore family was Linda Garrett, the town's head librarian. She had been working at the Millbrook Public Library for over 20 years and knew every family in town through their reading habits and research requests. What troubled her about the Delmores wasn't what they checked out, but what they requested through interlibrary loans. Edmund Delmore regularly ordered books about metallurgy, chemical compositions, and industrial furnace operations. These weren't casual hobby materials, they were technical manuals typically used by professionals in specialized fields. Margaret requested historical texts about preservation techniques, ancient burial practices, and folklore surrounding death rituals. From various cultures, the children's requests were equally unsettling. Advanced texts on biology, anatomy, and what Linda could only describe as morbid curiosities that seemed inappropriate for their ages. When Linda attempted to engage the family in conversation about their reading interests, they would politely deflect with vague explanations about educational pursuits and family research projects. Their library visits followed a rigid schedule, always on Tuesday evenings, always exactly 1 hour before closing, always with a predetermined list of materials they needed to access. They never browsed randomly, never showed interest in new arrivals, and never participated in community events hosted by the library. The pattern of their requests became increasingly concerning as months passed. Edmund began ordering materials about cremation processes, industrial heating systems, and the chemical properties of various organic compounds when exposed to extreme temperatures. Margaret's requests shifted toward historical accounts of families who had disappeared from communities without explanation, case studies of household fires that had burned for extended periods, and genealogical research techniques that seemed focused on erasing rather than preserving family histories. Dr. Samuel Peterson, the town's only physician, encountered his own red flags when Thomas Delmore arrived at his office with what appeared to be severe burn marks on his hands and forearms. The boy claimed he had accidentally touched a hot stove, but the pattern of injuries suggested prolonged exposure to extreme heat rather than a brief accidental contact. When Dr. Peterson attempted to examine the wounds more thoroughly, Thomas became agitated and insisted the injuries were healing properly without medical intervention. More disturbing was the boy's apparent tolerance for pain. Burns that should have required immediate medical attention and ongoing treatment seemed to cause him only mild discomfort. When Dr. Peterson pressed for more details about the accident, Thomas provided answers that were inconsistent and rehearsed, as if he had been coached on what to say. The physician's concerns deepened when he noticed similar scarring on the boy's arms that appeared to be from previous incidents. Dr. Peterson attempted to contact the Delmore parents to discuss proper wound care and the importance of preventing future accidents. Margaret returned his call within hours, speaking in measured tones about family medical practices and their preference for handling minor injuries at home. She assured him that Thomas was receiving appropriate care and that similar incidents would be prevented in the future. Her response was professional and courteous, but it left Dr. Peterson with the distinct impression that he was being managed rather than consulted. The local postal service began noticing irregularities in the Delmore family's mail patterns. Carrier Robert Hayes had been delivering mail to Elm Street for over a decade and was familiar with the typical correspondence patterns of every household on his route. The Delmores received an unusual amount of mail from government agencies, legal firms, and what appeared to be research institutions. Much of their correspondence was marked confidential or urgent, and it all seemed to arrive in cycles that coincided with phases of the moon. More concerning was the outgoing mail. The Delmores sent packages with unusual frequency, always. Sealed with excessive tape and marked with handling instructions that Hayes had never seen on residential mail. The packages were always collected by private courier services rather than standard postal delivery, and they were always sent to addresses that Hayes couldn't locate on any standard mapping system. When he casually inquired about the contents, Margaret would smile politely and mention family business, without providing any meaningful details. Hayes also noticed that the Delmores mailbox was collected far more frequently than normal residential. Delivery schedules required. Someone from the household would retrieve mail multiple times throughout the day, as if they were monitoring for specific deliveries. On several occasions, Hayes observed family members checking the mailbox at odd hours, sometimes well after midnight, using flashlights to examine correspondence that had been delivered earlier in the day. The most unsettling discovery came when Hayes accidentally delivered a piece of Delmore mail to the wrong address. When he returned to retrieve it, he noticed the envelope had been opened and resealed with clear tape. The contents appeared to be legal documents related to property transfers, but the addresses referenced locations that didn't exist according to county records. The paperwork seemed to involve multiple properties under different variations of the Delmore name, suggesting a complex web of real estate transactions that served purposes beyond simple property ownership. School officials began raising concerns when they realized the Delmore children had never been enrolled in any educational programs within the district. State homeschooling regulations required parents to register their intention to educate children at home and to provide periodic assessments of academic progress. The Delmores had filed no such paperwork, and when district administrators attempted to contact them about compliance requirements, they received carefully worded responses from a legal representative who claimed the children were enrolled in a private educational program that met all state requirements. Superintendent Janet Walsh found this explanation suspicious and initiated a more thorough investigation. Her research revealed that the private educational program referenced in the legal correspondence didn't exist according to state licensing databases. The legal representative who had responded to her inquiries was registered with the state bar association, but his office address led to a mail forwarding service, and his phone number was answered by an automated system that promised return calls within 24 hours. When Walsh attempted to conduct a home visit to assess the children's educational environment, she was met at the door by Edmund Delmore, who politely but firmly declined to allow her inside. He produced documentation that appeared to satisfy legal requirements for homeschooling, but Walsh noticed the paperwork was printed on letterhead from educational institutions that she couldn't verify through standard channels. The documents contained signatures from administrators with credentials that seemed legitimate. But when Walsh attempted to contact these institutions directly, she encountered phone numbers that had been disconnected and addresses that led to empty buildings. The most disturbing aspect of Walsh's interaction with Edmund was his children's behavior during her visit. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Peter stood silently behind their father, never speaking, never showing curiosity about the visitor, never displaying typical childhood reactions to an unfamiliar adult in their home. They observed the conversation with an intensity that was unsettling, as if they were evaluating every word for potential threats or opportunities. When Walsh mentioned specific educational requirements that homeschooled children needed to demonstrate. The children exchanged glances that suggested they understood implications she hadn't explicitly stated. Their non-verbal communication was sophisticated and coordinated, indicating a level of training or preparation that extended far beyond typical family dynamics. She left the Delmore property with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that whatever was happening in that house had nothing to do with conventional education. Martha Brennan lived 2 houses down from the Delmores and suffered from chronic insomnia that had plagued her for over a decade. Her sleepless nights had turned her into an inadvertent neighborhood watchwoman, observing the quiet activities that occurred while most residents were sleeping. What she witnessed at the Delmore house during those dark hours would haunt her for years to come. The visitors always arrived between 2 and 4 in the morning, materializing from the shadows, without any apparent means of transportation. Martha never saw cars pulling into the driveway, never heard footsteps on the gravel, never observed anyone walking down the sidewalk toward the house. They simply appeared as if emerging from the darkness itself, always approaching from the direction of the old cemetery that bordered the back of the Delmore property. These weren't ordinary visitors making social calls. They moved with purpose and urgency, carrying what appeared to be wrapped bundles or packages that they handled with extreme care. The packages were always roughly the same size and shape, approximately the length of a human torso, and they seemed to require 2 people to carry them safely. Martha watched through her bedroom window as these mysterious figures would disappear round the back of the Delmore house, always entering through a rear entrance that was hidden from street view. The most disturbing aspect of these nocturnal visits was the visitors themselves. Martha described them as appearing wrong in ways she couldn't articulate clearly. They wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their movements were too fluid, too coordinated, as if they were performing a rehearsed dance rather than simply walking. She never saw their faces clearly, but she noticed they all seemed to be approximately the same height and build, creating an unsettling uniformity that suggested they weren't random individuals, but members of some organized group. What made Martha's observations particularly credible was her attention to detail and her methodical approach to documenting what she witnessed. She began keeping a journal, noting the dates, times, and specific details of each visit. The pattern that emerged was chilling. The visits occurred in cycles that corresponded to lunar phases, with the most activity happening during new moons when natural darkness was at its peak. The visitors always arrived in groups of 3 or 4, always carried the same type of packages, and always remained inside the Delmore house for exactly 90 minutes before departing. Father Michael O'Brien had served as pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church for 15 years when he began noticing irregularities in the Delmore family's attendance and behavior during services. While they appeared every Sunday without fail, their participation felt mechanical and hollow, as if they were going through motions without any genuine spiritual connection or understanding. What troubled Father O'Brien most was the family's reaction to specific elements of the Catholic Mass. During prayers for the dead, the Delmores would become visibly agitated, shifting uncomfortably in their seats and exchanging meaningful glances that suggested the prayers held personal significance beyond typical religious observance. When hymns about redemption and forgiveness were sung, the family would mouth the words without producing any audible sound, as if they were afraid their voices might reveal something they preferred to keep hidden. The priest's concerns deepened when he noticed the family's response to holy water and blessed objects. While most parishioners would cross themselves with holy water upon entering the church, The Delmores would carefully avoid contact with the blessed water, taking elaborate routes around the font to reach their preferred seating area. During communion, they would receive the blessed bread with what appeared to be reluctance, and Father O'Brien observed that they seemed to have difficulties swallowing the consecrated wafer, often taking several minutes to complete what should have been a simple act of faith. Father O'Brien attempted to arrange private meetings with the family to discuss their spiritual needs and offer pastoral counseling. Edmund would politely decline these invitations, citing busy schedules and family commitments that prevented them from participating in additional church activities. When the priest persisted, suggesting that spiritual guidance might be particularly beneficial for the children, Margaret would respond with carefully worded explanations about their families' unique spiritual practices that complemented but didn't require traditional pastoral support. The most unsettling incident occurred during a Sunday service when young Peter Delmore appeared to have some kind of medical episode during the reading of scripture. The boy began trembling violently, his eyes rolling back in his head, and he started speaking in what Father O'Brien could only describe as a language that didn't sound human. The episode lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was intense enough to draw attention from other parishioners and cause considerable disruption to the service. Margaret and Edmund immediately flanked their son, whispering urgently in his ears, while maintaining composed expressions that suggested this type of incident was not unprecedented. They escorted Peter from the church without explanation, and when Father O'Brien attempted to follow them to offer assistance, he found the church doors had been locked from the outside, trapping the remaining congregation inside until the Delmores had sufficient time to leave the premises. Detective Ray Morrison had been investigating minor property crimes in the Millbrook area when he began receiving reports about unusual activities at the Delmore residence. The reports were vague and often contradictory, but they shared common elements that suggested something beyond normal residential behavior was occurring at the house on Elm Street. Multiple neighbors had reported seeing smoke rising from the Delmore property that didn't match the typical patterns of fireplace or chimney smoke. The smoke appeared to be darker and denser than normal wood smoke, and it carried an odor that residents described as organic and unpleasant without being able to identify the specific scent. More concerning was the timing of these smoke emissions, which seemed to coincide with the mysterious nighttime visits that Martha Brennan had been documenting. Detective Morrison conducted several informal surveillance operations, positioning himself at various locations around the neighborhood during the hours when unusual activity was most likely to occur. His observations confirmed many of the details that concerned residents had reported. The visitors who appeared without transportation, the packages they carried, and the precise timing of their arrivals and departures. What Morrison found most professionally concerning was the sophisticated level of operational security the Delmores maintained. They had installed motion sensors and surveillance equipment that exceeded typical residential security systems, and they seemed to be monitoring law enforcement communications through methods that suggested technical expertise beyond that of ordinary civilians. On multiple occasions, Morrison noticed that the family's activities would change or cease entirely when police patrols were scheduled to pass through their neighborhood, indicating they had advanced knowledge of law enforcement schedules. The detective's investigation was complicated by the fact that the Delmores weren't technically breaking any laws that he could identify. Their nocturnal visitors weren't trespassing if they were invited guests. Their unusual mail patterns weren't illegal if they were conducting legitimate business, and their home modifications weren't violations if they had obtained proper permits. However, The cumulative effect of all these individually innocent activities created a pattern that suggested something far more sinister than eccentric behavior. Morrison's concerns reached a critical point when he discovered that the Delmore family had been connected to similar reports in 3 other communities over the past decade. Using law enforcement databases, he traced a pattern of families with variations of the Delmore name who had lived in different towns throughout New England, always purchasing large houses with cash, always maintaining mysterious nocturnal activities, and always leaving communities abruptly after approximately 5 to 7 years of residence. The pattern suggested that whatever the Delmores were doing in Millbrook was part of a larger operation that had been ongoing for much longer than anyone had realized. Each previous residence had been associated with unexplained disappearances, unusual fire incidents, and reports of strange visitors that matched the descriptions Morrison was receiving from Millbrook residents. The implications were deeply troubling, suggesting that the Delmore family wasn't just an eccentric household, but potentially part of a criminal organization that had been operating undetected for years. The incident that would ultimately expose the true nature of the Delmore family began on a cold February morning when 8-year-old Sarah Collins went missing from her bedroom. Sarah lived 6 blocks from the Delmore house, and her disappearance sent shock waves through the tight-knit community of Millbrook. Her parents, David and Janet Collins, had put her to bed at 8 o'clock the previous evening, and when they went to wake her for breakfast, they found her room empty with no signs of struggle or forced entry. What made Sarah's disappearance particularly disturbing was the precision with which it had been executed. Her bedroom window was open, but it showed no evidence of tampering or damage. Her pajamas were neatly folded on her dresser, suggesting she had dressed herself before leaving. Most unnervingly, her beloved stuffed rabbit remained on her pillow, positioned exactly as she always placed it when preparing for sleep. This wasn't a random abduction or a child wandering off during the night. It was a carefully planned removal that suggested intimate knowledge of the Collins families, routines, and the layout of their home. The initial police investigation, led by Detective Morrison, focused on standard procedures for missing children cases. They interviewed family members, searched the immediate neighborhood, and began coordinating with state authorities to issue Amber Alerts and mobilize search teams. However, Morrison's previous observations about the Delmore family had planted seeds of suspicion that would prove prescient as the investigation progressed. The breakthrough came when Morrison reviewed security footage from various businesses along the route between the Collins home and the Delmore property. A traffic camera at the intersection of Elm Street and Main Street had captured footage of a small figure walking purposefully toward the Delmore house at approximately 3:30 in the morning. The figure was too small to be an adult, and the timestamp corresponded to the window of time when Sarah had disappeared from her bedroom. More importantly, the footage showed that the figure wasn't alone. Shadowy forms moved alongside the small figure, guiding and directing its movement in ways that suggested the child was being escorted rather than walking independently. The figures matched the descriptions of the mysterious visitors that Martha Brennan had been documenting, and their coordinated movement patterns indicated a level of organization that transformed Sarah's disappearance from a missing child case into a potential kidnapping investigation. When Morrison presented this evidence to his superiors, the Millbrook Police Department made the decision to obtain a search warrant for the Delmore property. The warrant application cited probable cause based on the security footage, the pattern of suspicious activities that had been documented by multiple residents, and the correlation between Sarah's disappearance and the timing of nocturnal visits to the Delmore house. The warrant was approved within hours. But when law enforcement officers arrived at the Delmore house to execute the search, they found the property apparently abandoned. The front door was unlocked, the windows were open, and there were no signs of the family anywhere on the premises. However, the house itself told a story that would haunt the investigating officers for years to come. The perpetual fire was still burning in the main fireplace, but it was no longer consuming wood or coal. Instead, the flames were feeding on materials that the officers initially couldn't identify, but which emanated an acrid, organic smell that made several team members physically ill. The fire was burning at a temperature that seemed impossible for a residential fireplace, and the heat was so intense that officers couldn't approach close enough to examine the fuel source without protective equipment. The basement revealed the most disturbing evidence. What the Delmores had described as a root cellar was actually a complex underground facility that extended far beneath the house's foundation. The space was divided into multiple chambers, each one designed for specific purposes that became increasingly horrifying as the investigation progressed. Some chambers contained what appeared to be laboratory equipment for chemical analysis and organic processing. Others were set up as holding areas with restraints and monitoring devices that suggested they had been used to contain unwilling occupants. The most shocking discovery was a chamber that contained personal belongings from at least 12 different children, carefully catalogued and preserved in a manner that suggested they were trophies or mementos rather than randomly collected items. Among these belongings were articles of clothing that matched descriptions of children who had disappeared from communities throughout New England over the past decade. Sarah Collins' pajamas were found neatly folded in a storage container that bore her name on a small label, indicating that her abduction had been planned and that she was part of a much larger pattern of victimization. The investigation also revealed the true purpose of the perpetual fire. The fireplace had been modified to function as a high-temperature incinerator, capable of completely destroying organic material without leaving identifiable remains. Chemical analysis of the ash and residue found in the fireplace confirmed the presence of human remains, but the intense heat had reduced everything to basic chemical compounds that couldn't be traced to specific individuals. The Delmores had been using their home as a processing facility for activities that extended far beyond anything the local community had imagined. The discovery of detailed Exbrooks records in Edmund Delmore's study revealed the scope of the operation. The family had been part of a network that acquired children for purposes that the documentation described in clinical terms that masked horrific realities. The children were systematically processed through various stages of physical and psychological conditioning before being transferred to other locations or ultimately disposed of through the modified fireplace system. Sarah Collins was found in one of the basement chambers, alive but in a state of severe psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to address. She had been subjected to experiences that had altered her fundamental understanding of reality, and her rescue came just days before she would have been transferred to the next stage of whatever process the Delmores had planned for her. Her survival was due largely to the timing of her disappearance and the quick response of law enforcement. But the investigation revealed that many other children had not been as fortunate. The evidence collected from the Delmore house painted a picture of systematic abuse and murder that had been ongoing for years. The family's carefully maintained facade of respectability had concealed activities that ranked among the most heinous crimes in the state's history. The perpetual fire had been consuming evidence of their crimes while simultaneously serving as a symbol of their commitment to maintaining their operation regardless of the risks or consequences. When news of the discoveries at the Delmore house reached the community, the reaction was a mixture of horror, disbelief, and guilt. Residents who had lived near the family for years struggled to reconcile their memories of polite neighbors with the reality of what had been occurring just blocks from their own homes. The signs had been there, but the sheer enormity of the crimes had made them almost impossible to believe or interpret correctly. The investigation expanded to include federal authorities, who recognized that the Delmore operation was part of a much larger criminal network that crossed state lines and potentially international boundaries. The careful record-keeping and sophisticated operational procedures suggested connections to organized crime groups that specialized in human trafficking and related activities. The Millbrook house had been just one node in a network that was far more extensive and dangerous than anyone had initially realized. In the aftermath of the Delmore investigation, Millbrook underwent a transformation that was both predictable and deeply troubling. The small town that had prided itself on community spirit and neighborly concern suddenly became a place where residents avoided eye contact, where conversations died when certain topics arose, and where the shared experience of having lived near monsters became a source of collective shame rather than mutual support. The town council held emergency meetings to discuss reputation management and economic impact mitigation. Local business owners worried that publicity from the Delmore case would discourage tourism and new residents. Real estate agents found themselves fielding questions about property values and neighborhood safety that they were unprepared to answer honestly. The general consensus seemed to be that the less said about the Delmore family, the sooner the community could return to normal. This conspiracy of silence wasn't coordinated or officially mandated. It emerged organically from residents' desperate desire to distance themselves from the horror that had been unfolding in their midst. People who had lived on Elm Street for decades suddenly found reasons to avoid walking past the Delmore house. Neighbors who had previously engaged in friendly conversations now hurried past each other with minimal acknowledgement. The community's response to trauma was to pretend it had never happened. Local media coverage was surprisingly limited, considering the magnitude of the crimes that had been uncovered. The Millbrook Gazette published brief, factual accounts of the police investigation and the charges that had been filed against the Delmore family members who had been apprehended. However, these articles carefully avoided details that might remind readers of their own proximity to the crimes or their failure to take action when warning signs were apparent. The most disturbing aspect of the town's silence was the way it extended to the victims. Sarah Collins and her family found themselves increasingly isolated as their neighbors struggled to deal with the reality that a child from their community had been victimized by people they had all known and interacted with. Rather than rallying around the Collins family, many residents seemed to view them as uncomfortable reminders of events they preferred to forget. It was in this environment of willful amnesia that Martha Brennan made the decision to speak publicly about her experiences and observations. The elderly woman who had documented the Delmore family's nocturnal activities felt a moral obligation to ensure that the truth was preserved, even if her community preferred to embrace comfortable lies. Martha's decision to speak wasn't easy or without consequences. She understood that her detailed knowledge of the Delmore family's activities would raise questions about why she hadn't taken action sooner. She was prepared for criticism and judgment from neighbors who might view her as a busybody or someone who had failed to protect innocent children. However, she also recognized that her testimony was crucial for understanding how the crimes had been able to continue for so long without detection. In interviews with law enforcement officials and later with journalists, Martha provided a comprehensive account of the patterns she had observed over several years. Her journal entries, sketches, and detailed notes became crucial evidence in the broader investigation of the Delmore network. More importantly, her willingness to speak truthfully about what she had witnessed became a catalyst for other residents to overcome their reluctance and share their own observations. Martha's most significant revelation concerned the basement chambers where Sarah Collins had been found. During her sleepless nights, she had occasionally heard sounds coming from the direction of the Delmore house that didn't match typical residential activities. These sounds occurred during the same time periods when the mysterious visitors were present, and they consisted of what she described as mechanical noises and muffled voices that suggested significant activity was occurring beneath the house. More disturbing was Martha's account of the times when these sounds included what could only be described as screaming. She had heard voices, primarily children's voices, coming from the direction of the Delmore property during the early morning hours when the mysterious visitors were present. The sounds were brief and intermittent, but they were distinct enough to convince her that people were being held against their will in the basement chambers that investigators later discovered. Martha's testimony also revealed the sophisticated methods the Delmore family had used to maintain their operation without detection. She had observed them using signal devices to communicate with their visitors, coordinating arrivals and departures to avoid overlap with neighborhood activities. They had installed landscaping and structural modifications that created blind spots and sound barriers, ensuring that their activities would be less likely to attract attention from neighbors or passers-by. The most chilling aspect of Martha's testimony was her description of the family's behavioral changes during periods when their activities intensified. She had noticed that the perpetual fire would burn more intensely during certain time periods, corresponding to increased visits from the mysterious figures and heightened activity in the basement chambers. The correlation between these elements suggested that the fire was being used to dispose of evidence from whatever activities were occurring beneath the house. Martha's account of the Delmore children's behavior provided crucial insights into how the family had maintained their operation. She had observed that Thomas, Elizabeth, and Peter were active participants in their parents' activities, not innocent victims who were unaware of what was occurring. The children had been trained to serve as lookouts, monitoring the neighborhood for potential threats and signaling when it was safe for their parents to proceed with their activities. The children's sophisticated understanding of operational security suggested that they had been involved in the family's crimes from an early age. Their ability to maintain normal appearances during public interactions while participating in horrific activities in private demonstrated a level of psychological conditioning that experts would later describe as systematic child abuse designed to create willing accomplices rather than traumatized victims. Martha's testimony also revealed the extent to which the Delmore family had been monitoring their neighbors and gathering intelligence about community activities. She had noticed that the family seemed to have advanced knowledge of events that hadn't been publicly announced, suggesting they were intercepting communications or had developed sources of information within the community. This surveillance capability had allowed them to modify their activities to avoid detection and to identify potential targets for their operations. The most important contribution of Martha's testimony was her documentation of the timeline of the Delmore family's activities. Her detailed records allowed investigators to correlate their crimes with missing children cases throughout the region, establishing patterns that would prove crucial for identifying additional victims and dismantling the broader network of which the Delmores had been a part. Martha's willingness to speak truthfully about her experiences stood in stark contrast to the silence that characterized most of the community's response to the Delmore investigation. Her courage in facing uncomfortable truths and accepting responsibility for her failure to act sooner provided a model for how communities should respond to systematic abuse and criminal activity in their midst. However, Martha's decision to speak publicly also made her a target for community members who viewed her testimony as disloyal or damaging to Millbrook's reputation. She received anonymous threats and found herself increasingly isolated from neighbors who preferred to maintain their silence about the Delmore family. The experience of being ostracized by people she had known for decades became a secondary trauma that would affect her for the rest of her life. Despite the personal cost, Martha never regretted her decision to speak truthfully about what she had witnessed. In later interviews, she would emphasize that her primary concern was ensuring that the victims of the Delmore family's crimes were not forgotten, and that the community learned from its failure to recognize and respond to obvious signs of systematic abuse. Her testimony became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case against the Delmore family and provided crucial evidence for the broader investigation into the criminal network they had served. Martha's final public statement about the Delmore case was delivered during the sentencing phase of the trial. She addressed the court directly, speaking not only about what she had observed but about the community's collective responsibility to protect vulnerable members of society. Her words served as both an indictment of the town's willful blindness and a call for residents to acknowledge their role in enabling crimes that could have been prevented if people had been willing to act on their suspicions. The contrast between Martha's courage and the community's silence highlighted fundamental questions about civic responsibility and the moral obligations of ordinary citizens when confronted with evidence of systematic abuse. Her testimony demonstrated that the information necessary to stop the Delmore family's crimes had been available to residents for years, but that social pressure and personal convenience had prevented people from taking action that might have saved lives. Social worker Amanda Richardson had been assigned to conduct a routine follow-up assessment of homeschooled children in the Millbrook area when she first encountered the inconsistencies in the Delmore family's educational documentation. What began as a standard administrative review quickly evolved into a comprehensive investigation that would uncover the sophisticated methods the family had used to avoid oversight and maintain their criminal operation. Richardson's initial contact with the Delmore family occurred 3 months before Sarah Collins' disappearance. She had been tasked with verifying that homeschooled children in the district were receiving appropriate educational services and meeting state-mandated learning objectives. The Delmore children were among 43 families she needed to assess, and initially, they seemed to be just another household that had chosen alternative education for personal or religious reasons. However, Richardson's extensive experience in child welfare had taught her to recognize subtle signs that indicated when families were concealing information or attempting to manipulate official processes. The Delmore family's responses to her inquiries contained elements that triggered her professional instincts and prompted her to conduct a more thorough investigation than she would typically perform for routine compliance assessments. The first red flag was the family's reaction to unannounced visits. Richardson's standard procedure was to schedule appointments with families to review educational materials and assess children's progress. However, she also conducted occasional surprise visits to ensure that the educational environment she observed during scheduled appointments was consistent with daily reality. When she arrived at the Delmore house for an unscheduled visit, She found the family's response was unusually coordinated and defensive. Edmund Delmore answered the door within seconds of her knock, as if he had been monitoring her approach. His manner was polite but tense, and he immediately began explaining why the timing of her visit was inconvenient. Before Richardson could respond, Margaret appeared with all 3 children, who were dressed in clean clothes and carrying educational materials that appeared to have been hastily assembled. The family's preparedness for an unexpected official visit suggested a level of vigilance that exceeded normal homeschooling family concerns. Richardson's assessment of the children's educational progress revealed additional inconsistencies. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Peter demonstrated academic abilities that were significantly advanced for their ages, but their knowledge seemed to be concentrated in specific areas that related to chemistry, biology, and what Richardson could only describe as applied sciences that were unusual for children receiving general education. Their reading comprehension was exceptional, but the materials they were familiar with consisted primarily of technical manuals and reference texts. Rather than age-appropriate literature, more concerning was the children's social development. Despite their intellectual abilities, they displayed emotional responses that seemed carefully controlled and monitored. They rarely spoke spontaneously, instead looking to their parents for guidance before responding to questions. When Richardson attempted to interview the children individually, they showed signs of anxiety and stress that suggested they had been coached on how to interact with authority figures. The educational materials the family presented for review were professionally prepared and comprehensive, but they contained elements that didn't match standard homeschooling curricula. The lesson plans included subjects like material science, organic chemistry applications, and thermal dynamics that were typically taught at the college level. When Richardson inquired about the appropriateness of such advanced material for elementary and middle school students, Margaret explained that the children were gifted and required accelerated instruction to maintain their interest in learning. Richardson's investigation expanded when she attempted to verify the credentials of the educational consultants who had allegedly designed the Delmore children's curriculum. The documentation provided by the family included impressive references and qualifications. But when Richardson contacted the institutions mentioned in the consultant's resumes, she discovered that several of them didn't exist or had no record of employing the individuals in question. The breakthrough in Richardson's investigation came when she noticed discrepancies in the family's financial documentation. Homeschooling families were required to demonstrate that they had sufficient resources to provide appropriate educational materials and experiences for their children. The Delmore family's financial statements indicated substantial income from sources that Richardson couldn't verify through standard databases and reference checks. Edmund Delmore claimed to be a consultant for industrial manufacturing companies, but the businesses he listed as clients either didn't exist or had no record of employing his services. Margaret's listed occupation was researcher, but the academic institutions she claimed to be affiliated with had no knowledge of her work or qualifications. The family's financial resources seemed to be derived from sources that they were unwilling or unable to document through conventional means. Richardson's concerns deepened when she discovered that the Delmore family had been investigated by child welfare agencies in previous communities where they had lived. The records were sealed or had been expunged, but the pattern of investigations suggested that concerns about the family's child-rearing practices had been raised before. The consistency of these concerns across multiple jurisdictions indicated that the Delmore family's current behavior was part of a long-term pattern rather than an isolated incident. The most significant discovery came when Richardson attempted to verify the children's medical records and vaccination history. The documentation provided by the family indicated that the children had received appropriate medical care. But when Richardson contacted the healthcare providers mentioned in the records, she found that many of them couldn't confirm treating the Delmore children, or didn't have records that matched the family's claims. This discrepancy was particularly troubling because it suggested that the children might not be receiving proper medical care, or that their health information was being falsified for reasons Richardson couldn't determine. The implications extended beyond educational compliance to potential child endangerment, transforming her investigation from an administrative review into a child welfare emergency. Richardson's investigation was further complicated by the family's sophisticated understanding of legal and bureaucratic processes. When she requested additional documentation or clarification about inconsistencies she had identified, the family would respond through legal representatives who provided technically adequate responses that satisfied procedural requirements while revealing no meaningful information about the family's actual circumstances. The legal representatives were skilled at using bureaucratic language and procedural technicalities to deflect inquiries and delay investigative processes. They would provide extensive documentation that appeared to address Richardson's concerns while actually obscuring the information she needed to assess the children's welfare. This pattern of legal obstruction suggested that the family had experience dealing with official investigations and had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding scrutiny. Richardson's most disturbing discovery was evidence that the Delmore children were being used as participants in activities that extended far beyond educational experiences. She found references in the family's documentation to practical applications and field experience that seemed to involve the children in adult activities that were inappropriate for their ages. The vague language used to describe these activities made it impossible to determine exactly what the children were being asked to do, but the implications were deeply concerning. The investigation reached a critical point when Richardson discovered that the basement space she had briefly observed during her home visit was significantly larger than what would be expected for a typical residential property. The architectural plans on file with the city showed a standard basement, but Richardson's observations suggested that the space had been extensively modified or expanded beyond what was reflected in official documentation. This discrepancy prompted Richardson to contact law enforcement officials and request a more comprehensive investigation of the Delmore family's activities. Her professional assessment was that the children were at risk and that the family's behavior indicated the possibility of criminal activity that extended beyond educational non-compliance. Her report became one of the key pieces of evidence that supported the search warrant application that would ultimately expose the full scope of the Delmore family's crimes. Richardson's investigation demonstrated how systematic criminals could exploit gaps in bureaucratic oversight and use legal technicalities to avoid detection. The Delmore family's sophisticated understanding of official processes had allowed them to maintain their operation for years while appearing to comply with regulations and requirements. Her persistence in pursuing inconsistencies that other officials might have overlooked proved crucial for uncovering crimes that had been carefully concealed behind facades of respectability and legal compliance. The execution of the search warrant at the Delmore property on March 15th began at dawn with a coordinated effort involving local police, state investigators, federal agents, and specialized forensic teams. Detective Morrison led the operation. drawing on months of investigation and evidence gathering that had built a compelling case for probable cause. However, nothing in the investigative preparation had adequately prepared the team for the horrific discoveries that awaited them inside the Victorian mansion on Elm Street. The initial entry into the house revealed a residence that appeared to have been abandoned in haste. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the main living areas, and there were signs that the family had packed quickly and left during the night. However, the perpetual fire continued to burn in the main fireplace, its flames consuming materials that produced an acrid smoke that forced investigators to don protective equipment before proceeding with their search. The first floor of the house contained living spaces that seemed designed for public presentation rather than actual family life. The furniture was expensive but seldom used. The books on the shelves were primarily technical manuals and reference texts, and the kitchen showed minimal evidence of regular meal preparation. The overall impression was of a house that served as a facade for activities that occurred elsewhere on the property. The basement access was concealed behind a bookshelf in Edmund Delmore's study, a hidden entrance that required specific knowledge to locate and operate. When investigators discovered the mechanism that opened the concealed door, they found a staircase that descended far deeper than would be expected for a typical residential basement. The stairs led to a complex of underground chambers that had been excavated and constructed with the precision of a professional installation. The basement complex consisted of multiple levels and chambers, each one designed for specific purposes. That became increasingly disturbing as the investigation progressed. The upper level contained what appeared to be laboratory space, with equipment for chemical analysis, material processing, and what forensic experts later identified as facilities for human experimentation. The laboratory was equipped with professional instruments that would have been expensive to acquire and difficult to operate without specialized training. The middle level of the basement complex contained holding cells that had been designed to contain human subjects. The cells were equipped with restraints, monitoring equipment, and life support systems that indicated they had been used to hold people for extended periods. The construction was sophisticated and permanent, suggesting that the Delmore family had planned to maintain their operation for years, rather than as a temporary arrangement. The lowest level of the basement complex was the most horrifying discovery. This area contained what could only be described as a processing facility, with equipment and spaces designed for activities that investigators would later describe in legal documents as systematic torture and murder. The facility included areas for physical conditioning, psychological manipulation, and ultimately disposal of victims through the modified fireplace system that connected to the main house. The discovery of detailed records in Edmund Delmore's concealed office revealed the scope and duration of the family's criminal operation. The records documented the acquisition, processing, and disposal of at least 47 children over a period of 12 years. The documentation was methodical and professional, treating human victims as inventory items in a systematic business. Operation. The records revealed that the Delmore family had been part of a much larger network of criminals who specialized in child trafficking and related activities. The network operated across multiple states and potentially international boundaries, with the Millbrook house serving as one of several processing facilities where victims were prepared for transfer to other locations or ultimately murdered. To eliminate evidence of the operation, the forensic analysis of the modified fireplace system confirmed that it had been used to dispose of human remains with industrial efficiency. The system was capable of achieving temperatures that would completely incinerate organic material, leaving only basic chemical compounds that couldn't be traced to specific individuals. The analysis of ash and residue found in the fireplace confirmed the presence of human remains from multiple victims. The most traumatic discovery was the rescue of Sarah Collins, who was found in one of the basement holding cells in a state of severe psychological trauma. Sarah had been subjected to experiences that had fundamentally altered her understanding of reality, and her rescue came just days before. She would have been transferred to the next stage of the process that would have ultimately led to her death. Discovery of personal belongings from dozens of missing children provided crucial evidence for connecting the Delmore operation to unsolved cases throughout the region. The belongings had been carefully preserved and catalogued, suggesting that they served as trophies for the family's crimes. Among the items were clothing, toys, and personal effects from children who had disappeared over the past decade, providing investigators with evidence to solve cases that had remained mysteries for years. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods the Delmore family had used to acquire their victims. They had developed detailed profiles of vulnerable children in communities throughout the region, identifying those who would be less likely to be missed immediately or whose disappearances might be attributed to other causes. The selection process was methodical and strategic, demonstrating a level of planning that indicated the crimes were systematic rather than opportunistic. The basement complex contained evidence of the family's connections to other criminal organizations. Communication, equipment, financial records, and operational documents revealed that the Delmore family was part of a network that extended far beyond their individual operation. The network included suppliers who provided children for processing, customers who purchased processed victims, and support services that helped maintain the operation's security and efficiency. The discovery of the Delmore family's crimes sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies throughout the region. The sophistication of their operation, the duration of their activities, and the number of victims involved made it one of the most significant criminal cases in the state's history. The evidence collected from the basement complex would provide the foundation for prosecutions that would continue for years and investigations that would ultimately dismantle the larger network of which the Delmores had been a part. The psychological impact on the investigators who discovered the basement complex was severe and lasting. Many of the officers and forensic specialists who worked on the case required counseling and support to process the trauma of witnessing evidence of such systematic abuse and murder. The discoveries at the Delmore house challenged their understanding of human nature and forced them to confront realities that would affect their professional and personal lives for years to come. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the Delmore family had been monitoring and manipulating their community to maintain their operation. They had developed extensive intelligence networks that allowed them to identify potential threats and modify their activities to avoid detection. Their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting such horrific crimes demonstrated the sophisticated nature of their operation and the challenges law enforcement faces in detecting and preventing such systematic abuse. The arrest of Edmund and Margaret Delmore occurred simultaneously in separate locations, demonstrating the coordinated nature of the law enforcement response to their crimes. Edmund was apprehended at a truck stop in Pennsylvania, where he had been attempting to establish contact with other members of the criminal network. Margaret was arrested at a motel in New Jersey, where she had been waiting for transportation to a safe house that fed her. Investigators had been monitoring for months. The arrests were the culmination of a multi-state investigation that had been ongoing since the discovery of the basement complex at the Millbrook house. Federal agents had been tracking the Delmore family's movements and communications, building a comprehensive case that would ensure successful prosecution, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the larger criminal network they had served. The children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Peter, presented unique challenges for the legal system. Their ages and their role as both victims and participants in their parents' crimes created complex questions about criminal responsibility and appropriate intervention. Child psychology experts were brought in to assess their mental state and determine their capacity to understand the nature of their actions during the years they had lived with the family. The legal proceedings revealed that the children had been systematically conditioned from early ages to participate in their parents' criminal activities. They had been taught to view their victims as objects rather than human beings, and they had been trained to assist in various aspects of the operation, including surveillance, victim acquisition, and evidence disposal. The conditioning they had received was so comprehensive that deprogramming efforts would require years of intensive therapy and support. The prosecution of the Delmore case involved multiple jurisdictions and required coordination between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. The crimes crossed state lines, involved federal violations related to child trafficking and murder, and connected to international criminal networks that required federal investigation and prosecution. The complexity of the case required the largest prosecutorial team that had ever been assembled in the state's history. The evidence collected from the Delmore house provided the foundation for solving dozens of missing children cases that had remained unsolved for years. Forensic analysis of the personal belongings found in the basement complex allowed investigators to identify victims and provide closure to families who had been searching for their children for decades. The resolution of these cases provided some measure of justice for the victims and their families, but it also revealed the full scope of the Delmore family's crimes. The trial proceedings were conducted with unprecedented security measures and media restrictions. The horrific nature of the crimes and the potential for copycat incidents required law enforcement to implement protection protocols that had never been used in the state's legal system. The courtroom was closed to the public during testimony about the most disturbing aspects of the case, and psychological support was provided to jurors who were exposed to evidence of systematic child abuse and murder. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for victim impact statements from families whose children had been murdered by the Delmore family. These statements were emotionally devastating and provided the court with a clear understanding of the lasting impact of the crimes on the victims' families and communities. The statements also revealed the broader social cost of the Delmore family's crimes, including the destruction of community trust and the trauma experienced by residents who had lived unknowingly near such systematic evil. Edmund Delmore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and child abuse. Margaret Delmore received a similar sentence for her role in the crimes. The sentences were the maximum possible under state law, and they ensured that the couple would never again have the opportunity to harm children or participate in criminal activities. The legal proceedings also addressed the financial aspects of the Delmore family's crimes. Investigators discovered that the family had accumulated substantial assets through their criminal activities, including properties in multiple states and financial accounts that contained millions of dollars. These assets were seized and distributed to victim compensation funds and organizations that provided support to survivors of child abuse. The investigation into the broader criminal network that the Delmore family had served continued for years. After their arrests, federal agents used the intelligence gathered from the Millbrook house to identify and prosecute other members of the network, ultimately dismantling an organization that had been operating for decades. The success of these prosecutions demonstrated the importance of the evidence collected from the Delmore house and the value of comprehensive investigation in addressing systematic criminal activity. The town of Millbrook struggled to process the reality of what had occurred within its borders. The revelation that such horrific crimes had been committed by people who had been accepted as respectable members of the community forced residents to confront uncomfortable questions about their own judgment and their responsibility to protect vulnerable members of society. The collective trauma experienced by the community required professional intervention and ongoing support to address. The Delmore house itself became a symbol of the community's failure to recognize and respond to obvious signs of criminal activity. The perpetual fire that had burned for years was finally extinguished, but the house remained empty and avoided by residents, who were reminded of their proximity to evil whenever they passed the property. Eventually, the house was demolished, and the lot was converted to a memorial garden dedicated to the victims of the Delmore family's crimes. The legal fallout from the Delmore case extended to questions about the effectiveness of oversight systems that were supposed to protect children from abuse. The family's ability to operate undetected for years while maintaining the facade of legitimate homeschooling raised concerns about gaps in regulatory systems and the need for more comprehensive monitoring of families who chose alternative education options. The case also highlighted the importance of community vigilance and the responsibility of ordinary citizens to report suspicious activities to authorities. The signs of the Delmore family's crimes had been visible to neighbors and community members for years, but social pressure and personal convenience had prevented people from taking action that might have saved lives. The tragedy served as a reminder that protecting children from systematic abuse requires active participation from all members of society. The story of the Delmore family represents one of the most disturbing cases of systematic child abuse and murder in American criminal history. Their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting horrific crimes for over a decade demonstrates the sophisticated nature of modern criminal enterprises and the challenges law enforcement faces in detecting and preventing such activities. The perpetual fire that burned in the Delmore house for 17 years was more than just an unusual domestic arrangement. It was a symbol of the family's commitment to destroying evidence of their crimes and maintaining their operation, regardless of the risks or consequences. The fire consumed not only physical evidence, but also the lives of innocent children who became victims of a systematic process designed to satisfy the demands of a criminal network that treated human beings as commodities. The case also revealed the extent to which communities can become complicit in criminal activity through willful ignorance and collective denial. The residents of Millbrook had access to information that should have triggered investigations into the Delmore family's activities, but social pressure and personal convenience prevented them from taking action that might have saved lives. The tragedy serves as a reminder that protecting vulnerable members of society requires active participation from all citizens, not just law enforcement professionals. The investigation and prosecution of the Delmore family demonstrated the importance of interagency, cooperation, and comprehensive investigation in addressing systematic criminal activity. The case required coordination between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, as well as cooperation from multiple jurisdictions and international partners. The success of the prosecution was due largely to the thorough investigation that uncovered the full scope of the family's crimes and their connections to broader criminal networks. The lasting impact of the Delmore case extends beyond the immediate victims and their families to include the broader community that was forced to confront the reality of systematic evil in their midst. The psychological trauma experienced by residents, investigators, and legal professionals who worked on the case required ongoing support and intervention. The case changed the way communities think about child protection and the responsibility of ordinary citizens to report suspicious activities. The story of the Delmore family also highlights the resilience of human nature and the capacity for survival even in the face of systematic abuse. Sarah Collins' rescue and recovery, while traumatic and ongoing, demonstrated that victims of even the most severe abuse can heal and rebuild their lives with appropriate support and intervention. Her survival serves as a testament to the importance of never giving up hope and continuing to fight for justice even in the most difficult circumstances. The Delmore case has become a subject of study for law enforcement professionals, child protection experts, and criminal justice researchers who seek to understand how such systematic crimes can be prevented in the future. The lessons learned from the investigation and prosecution have been incorporated into training programs and policy recommendations that aim to improve the detection and prevention of child abuse and trafficking. The empty lot where the Delmore house once stood has been transformed into a memorial garden that honors the victims of the family's crimes. The garden serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and community responsibility in protecting vulnerable members of society. It also provides a space for reflection and healing for those who were affected by the crimes and their aftermath. The perpetual fire that once burned in the Delmore house has been extinguished, but the memory of what it represented continues to serve as a warning about the capacity for evil that can exist behind facades of respectability and normalcy. The case reminds us that protecting children from systematic abuse requires constant vigilance, active participation from all members of society, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about the communities in which we live. Some houses don't remember joy. They echo control, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of innocence. The Delmore house was one such place, where the warmth of a perpetual fire masked the cold calculation of systematic murder. But from the ashes of that destroyed house and the lives it consumed, a community learned the importance of speaking truth, protecting the vulnerable, and never again allowing willful blindness to enable such systematic evil. The story of the Delmore family serves as both a warning and a call to action. It reminds us that evil can exist in the most unexpected places and that protecting innocent lives requires courage, vigilance, and the willingness to act on our suspicions even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. The victims of the Delmore family's crimes cannot be brought back, but their memory can serve as motivation for all of us to be better, protectors of the vulnerable members of our communities. If you found this story as disturbing and compelling as we did, please subscribe to the Creepy Journal for more stories they tried to forget. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an entry from our dark collection of true crime cases that reveal the hidden horrors that can exist in seemingly normal communities. And remember, sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply pay attention to what's happening around us, because the signs are often there if we're willing to see them. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that the truth, no matter how disturbing, must always be told.